G'day YouTube, warbles on a lot here. Vale Seaughan McCosker. May come as a bit of a surprise to some people, but 20 years ago I had a fair bit to do with Seaughan McCosker. We'd had a fair bit to do with each other for about 9 years. Seaughan McCosker was a magistrate on the local court session. I used to see him in Glen Innes, I used to see him in Armidale. I know he used to work in Vale and Tenterfield as well, but Glen Innes and Armidale is where I used to appear before Seaughan McCosker. Now, it may seem a bit unusual what I'm going to tell you about, but there are not too many self-represented litigants who've got good things to say about the magistrates who have heard their cases. So that's one unusual point to this. Another unusual point to this is, having racked my forgettery all day since I heard that he had passed away, I think I can remember how to spell the man's first name. I always thought it was S-H-A-W-N. I'm pretty sure the way I've spelled it in the video title is the way it was written under his signature on the last piece of paper that he generated for me, or to apply to me and my family. So Seaughan never ever heard any case in which I was a defendant representing myself against Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors and duly appointed minions. Seaughan only ever heard cases in which I was appearing representing myself in the family court and the children's court. So I'm going to have to box a little careful in what I say, because certain things cannot be revealed. However, certain things are not prohibited from being revealed, I don't think. And if perhaps I am transgressing a hairy, airy-fairy fringe line, I hope I will be forgiven. Now, I learned of the man's death this morning during a telephone call from a woman who was a very close friend of my mother. I'm not going to tell you her name either, at least not her married name. Her maiden name was Audette McCarthy. I think my mother taught her how to sew 60 years ago or so. Anyway, Sean's name came up apropos of something completely different in the conversation, and Audette said to me, "Chris, I didn't know you were acquainted with Seaughan. Did you know that he died a couple of days ago?" And I was quite shocked and surprised, because, as I said, I haven't seen him for 20 years, and he seemed pale and hearty to me last time I saw him, and I had therefore had him pegged in my mind as still going strong. But apparently he retired, and yeah, he's now died. So why am I making a memorial video about a magistrate? Well, he taught me a lot. I had already become aware of the fact that if you're representing yourself in court, it's a really bad idea to stand out on the footpath with all the other self-represented litigants, people who are waiting for the duty solicitor to take their case, and swap optimistic stories with each other about how you're going to defeat the system. That always seemed to me to be a fool of an idea. The more successful strategy is to show up early at the courthouse, pretty much wait around until the clerk of the court reads your name out and ticks it off on the roster of people who have showed up, otherwise bad things will unroll for you. And then ignore all the clowns on the footpath telling you how they're going to do a Perry Mason. Go in and sit down in the visitors gallery and shut up. And unless they kick you out because it's a children's court matter, or it's a closed court for some other reason, stay there and watch what happens, and listen to who says what, and see what works, and figure out what sort of a mood the magistrate is in. And slowly, progressively, during the various mentioned hearings for which one has to attend for any particular matter, by the time you get in there to be actually giving evidence, or examining a witness, or cross-examining a witness, or making a deposition, you should have some fair idea of what actually occurs in court versus what happens on the TV and in the movies. Anyway, that was my approach to the saga. And the saga that Seaughan got himself stuck with having to deal with regarding myself, it started out as a family court matter which had been ordered by the family court in Newcastle, and certain specific holiday access orders were made and certain specific thou shalt nots were included in the final orders. I'm not going to tell you the case number of the case that it was, although it's lawful for me to tell you, but this is a public media thing and there's no way that you're allowed to identify subjects of orders or people who are subject to orders of the family court. So therefore I'm probably breaking a technical law by divulging that a case went on, but I'm not telling you which case. Anyway, the way it came up in front of Seaughan is when my other half chose to, in my opinion, break the family court judge's orders on matters of holiday access and later on matters of how the children were being treated, I went in and I asked the clerk of the court to furnish me with the blank, ready to be filled in paperwork in order to submit a section 112 AD1A application to have the aforementioned other half brought before the court and dealt with for not obeying a family court judge's orders. So I was the textbook definition of the bush lawyer, self-represented litigant showing up asking the court to deal with himself, themselves, rather than putting it through a solicitor. So Seaughan had to deal with that. And then he had to cope with the fact that being taken to court merely made the other half dig their little heels in and do it again. And again. And again. And again. And when I went in there, I said, okay, can we add another complaint to the old paperwork? The answer was no. No, Warbles, you cannot add a new instance to the old paperwork. So eventually there grew to become 12 separate 112 AD1A applications simultaneously afoot and running for the other half to be dealt with for failing to keep the family court judge's orders, all in Seaughan's court. And I could see he was getting sick and tired of it, but I had also, well, by that stage the custody case had run for 2 years before I lost custody for 4 years, and it was in that 4 years that all this stuff was coming up. And I'd come to the conclusion that when you first appear in front of the family court, the official judicial assumption is that both sides are going to tell about 50% lies in everything they say about the other side. So in my estimation, my observation, the official judicial system seems to be that whoever's sitting on the bench when he's dealing with family court matters, and perhaps with some other matters, they simply discard the more outrageous half, 50% of what both sides say, and they figure that about half of what they are complaining about on both sides is likely to be true. And I'm sure in the normal bell curve distribution of bullshit that runs throughout society, that's plenty accurate enough for normal things. However, and here we go to the first segue, once upon a time I thought I was a really high grade, high performance bullshit artist. I thought I was so smart I could tell bullshit to anyone and sell them on it and they would stay sold on it. And when I was about 18, I told a lie to bank card. And when I was about 19, they caught me. And by the time it came for sentencing, because I pleaded guilty, a different magistrate sentenced me. And the upshot of that was I have had the experience of standing in the dock and being obliged to admit to being a bullshit artist. It was deeply humiliating. And I emerged from that process on a good behaviour bond with a criminal record. And I decided, forgive the cough, the radiotherapy is starting to affect the epiglottis, and coughing is now an important thing that has to be dealt with as a solo matter. Anyway, what I decided was I had two options. I could either practice my bullshitting skills until I thought I could successfully get away with lying, and that was going to mean I had to remember every lie I ever told everyone, so I could keep them all straight in my head and then juggle them all simultaneously anytime I met that individual, so I could go back into character and reinforce the old lie. And I thought, That's a crippling workload. I'll never get anything else done. The other option was to give up trying to tell lies and attempt to only tell the truth, because that way I've only got one story I have to remember. And if somebody gets to hear something that they can't cope with, well, tough, they should not have asked the question. So that was the mindset I was in when I launched when I was sued for custody, and that was the mindset I was in as I was going through the family court, and that's how come I managed to figure out what was going on in terms of the 50% discount both sides, because it's probably going to be bullshit system which I was caught up in. So I just kept on plodding along. That's how come every time she did something else, I just filed another application and filed another application, filed another application. And whereas I represented myself, the other half kept on applying for legal aid and applying for legal aid and running up bills at the solicitors. We even got to the stage where I was subpoenaed by the Crown as a witness in a different court case entirely, and the bloke who was going to court then had engaged the same solicitor that my other half was using. So I went in and I put on a really, really sparkling performance from the witness box, and I did my level best to make that other bloke's solicitor feel utterly crushed. And yeah, the Crown won its case against his client. And then the next time I turned up to be the same witness in the district court, the bloody district court judge didn't show up. And by that stage, the other side decided that, this is not going to go very well. So they changed their entire line of attack, and they said, well, you see, our client did in fact say everything that Mr. Warbles-on-a-lot says that he said, but our client was lying to Mr. Warbles-on-a-lot, and Mr. Warbles-on-a-lot was just gullible to the point where he believed everything, and that's why his story is what it is. So when he admitted to being a bullshit artist who'd snowed me with crap, then he was let go. He'd been charged with concealing a serious crime, you see. So anyway, that was a performance that Sean saw me put on in the witness box. He'd seen me at the bar table. He never saw me in the dock. And eventually, gradually, either he figured out that I wasn't fitting their system, or as I like to put it, after 7 years, when it takes two hands for the clerk of the court to lift up the case file and drop it on somebody's desk and say, ha, you're stuck with this problem, that's about the point when the case file fills a box. That's when the system decides, look, standard operating procedure is not working with this. We're going to have to actually pay attention, work our way through what all the submissions are on both sides, and we're going to have to see who's telling how much bullshit. So after 7 years of losing by telling the truth in court, all of a sudden I started to not lose. I started to not lose when Sean decided that this was actually going to be a situation where if I won my case, and he'd seen what had gone on for a couple of years, and it was entirely possible in his view that I might win my case, then someone was going to have to be sent to jail. And he didn't want to do that. Not on a family court matter as a local court magistrate, so he promoted the whole thing back to Newcastle, and they set aside 4 or 5 days for hearing the 12 simultaneous 112 AD1A applications. And at about that stage, the Department of Community Services realised that their preferred client was about to get heavily engaged in the family court, and it looked like they were not on a very, very good wicket. So I arrived in Newcastle to be served with a children's court summons to appear at Armidale on the same day that the Newcastle family court matters were commencing, which was a bit tricky. Best I could do was get my mother to drive down to Armidale, and she appeared as the grandmother of the children involved, asking for an adjournment. And while she was there, a bloke walked up to her, and he turned out to be a PhD at biology, also a lawyer, and he said, "Madam, you probably should talk to my wife. She does a lot of work with these sorts of cases, and my mother engaged that bloke's wife, and the more they got involved with it, this bloke decided that it could be pretty interesting. So he paid a bit of attention and gave me some help and advice, and he appeared for me on two occasions in front of two different venues, pro bono. No win, no fee, and he won on one of them, and he never ever claimed that fee, and he won on the other one, and he expected to get paid out by the suitors fund at the Supreme Court for that one, but as it happened, somebody else got that. I think it was the barrister working for the children's guardian ad litem's solicitor. Like I said, it was a complicated little matter. So anyway, when it got to the point where Seaughan McCosker, as the Children's Court Magistrate, ordered a specialist child psychiatrist report, then the Department of Community Services decided that this wasn't looking good for them at all, because they'd been supporting the other side, and it looked like when they put it into the Children's Court, it was going to go the same way as the Family Court. So then what I consider to be an absolutely unprecedented event occurred. The New South Wales Department of Community Services sued the Children's Court Magistrate in Glen Innes for ordering a specialist child psychiatrist report, because Doc said that's an abusive process. So they applied to the Crown Solicitor to represent them. The Crown Solicitor lodged the papers against Seaughan McCosker in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, and the Crown Solicitor was, of course, defending Seaughan against their own prosecution. Therefore, they named me as second defendant, and I had to defend myself and Seaughan in the Supreme Court of New South Wales in order to overrule the objections of the Department of Community Services, who wanted to squash the whole idea of the specialist child psychiatrist report. That was when the bloke whose wife was representing my mother took me on as a no-win, no-fee client in the Supreme Court, expecting to get paid out of the suitors fund, which is a special pot of money just for people whose case does need to go to the Supreme Court. They have no lawyer, they can't afford a lawyer, and somebody has to pay for a lawyer. But like I said, the barrister representing the solicitor for the children's guardian ad litem, or the guardian ad litem solicitor, whatever it was, that's who got the suitors fund. And behold, when I defended Seaughan McCosker's right to apply for a specialist child psychiatrist report in the Supreme Court, the PhD at law who fell down out of the sky offering to work for me for nothing, because what is the good of having a God theory if it does not work every day in real time? That bloke won for me in the Supreme Court, and the specialist child psychiatrist report was written and tendered, and Seaughan McCosker got to read it, and as a result, the second one of my two children was taken away from my wife by the Children's Court and given to my mother. Couldn't be given to me because I live in a lawn locker. She lives in a proper street legal house. So that, 20 years ago, in September 2002, that was the last time I appeared in front of Seaughan McCosker. I'm happy to say that effectively every case I ever appeared in, representing myself in front of him, I won. And he actually gave me some very good advice one time. We were in Glen Innes. We were there for a family court hearing where I had filed a 13th Section 112 AD 1A application after the first 12 got to the point where the judge in Newcastle, because I had to fight that while the Children's Court was on in Armidale. In Newcastle, I was told basically all bar one of your 112 AD 1A applications, all bar one of them are going to fall over for various reasons, Mr. Wharton. You have got a reasonable chance on the other one, but you might lose it too. And it'll be very bad for you if you do win. If you do lose, it won't be real good if you win, because that'll cause all sorts of other problems. Would you like to consider withdrawing that case as well? So as a gesture of goodwill, I withdrew the final case that had caused the whole kerfuffle to be moved to Newcastle, and I hoped that my other half would proceed on the basis that she should obey the family court orders. However, she did not. Probably because my son self-rescued and got out of there, and that's when the other matter came to be raised. So anyway, there I was in front of Seaughan. The other half was a no-show. I told him I'd been unable to serve the papers on her because she'd taken out... Actually, yeah, there was one matter where I lost. That was when she took out an apprehended domestic violence order against me to try and stop me from serving the family court summons. And really the only hard reason I could have put up was that, you know, I didn't menace. I just drove past the house to see whether she was there, because she didn't provide the daughter for holiday access at all at that point. And Seaughan said to me, look, why don't you serve it on her at the Armidale courthouse when we meet together there next week for that children's court matter? And I said, well, I'd love to, but I can't serve it on her in the court. And he leaned over and he looked at me and he covered his microphone and he said, no, you can't serve it in the courtroom, but there's nothing to stop you from serving it anywhere else on the court precincts. You can serve her in the waiting room, you can serve her in the court office as a clerk of the court, you can serve her out the front on the footpath. You just can't serve her in this courtroom, in the courtroom. And I thought, and I said, thank you very much, Mr. McCosker. I never called him Your Worship or Your Honour, because I have sort of, there's that prohibition against telling bullshit. I don't worship the man. I honour him, but in the magistrate's court you're supposed to call him Your Worship. So yeah, I called him Mr. McCosker. Yes, Mr. McCosker. Yes, Mr. Magistrate. And he got used to that. Well, I'm an eccentric, I'm allowed my little foibles. So I went down to Armidale and I had a pretty good idea of the lay of the land down there. And the old courthouse, they had the main court room and they had an airlock exit onto a courtyard, and off the courtyard there was another door into the clerk of the court's office, and on the side of the public area of the clerk of the court's office there was a door that led to a corridor, and immediately inside that door there was a door into the main court, and that was the corridor that led to the jury room. And I knew from prior experience that my wife was going to sing a song of what a terrible violent man Warbles is, therefore I need to sit in the women's quivering room where I can be sheltered from the wrath of my evil, violent husband. And there's a lot of women who do need that, so if somebody decides to exercise that privilege, maybe when it's not necessary, we've got yellow-tailed black cockatoos flying in circles over my head listening to this, so I don't know whether I'm being patted on the head by the forces of nature or warned to shut up. I'm going to keep going. So what happened was, while the proceedings were obviously winding up to the morning tea adjournment, I stood up, I bowed to the bench, because that's what you got to do. Mind you, I had already, for pro forma reasons, stood up, walked over, dropped the papers into her lap and said, you are served. She'd thrown them on the ground. I looked up to Seaughan McCosker, I'd nodded my head, I picked the papers up off the ground, I went back, sat at the bar table, waited and waited and waited. When it became clear that the morning tea adjournment was approaching, stood up, bowed to the bench, turned around, went out through the airlock, went into the public area of the clerk of the court's office, cracked open the door, maybe that much, and I waited. And I waited, and I waited. And eventually the door opened and the trouble and strife came through, and as she came through the door and she turned around, she had a briefcase in one hand and her elbow was kind of like that with the case, and I stuck the papers through her elbow and I said, now you're served, and I pulled the door back with a clang, and then there was a thwack as the papers hit the door, and then there was a screaming, howling noise, and I could hear her wailing all the way to the women's quivering room because she really did not want to get that summons. She was trying to avoid that summons. I had declined to suggest to the magistrate, which was Seaughan in Armidale, that the major reason I really didn't want to get a violence order was not only that it would make it more difficult to serve the papers, because how do you approach someone to serve papers if there's a violence order that says you can't? Answer is, approach them at the court when both of you are ordered to go there. The other thing was, I was hoping at that point to get my shooter's licence back so that I could reacquaint myself with my grandfather's semi-automatic target rifle that I'd taken to boarding school when I was a teenager, and I had been captain of the rifle team. So it was just a sentimental thing, but it wasn't worth introducing into a court case matter that was about other stuff. So I'd left that in abeyance. So yeah, violence order against me, that was the only place I could serve her. I didn't know about it. Sean gave me the advice. Thank you, Sean, that worked really well. So eventually, yeah, Sean and I had a lot going on over the years. I found him to be scrupulously fair. He was interested in the actual outcome, and he was the man who taught me how terribly difficult the job of magistrate is. And he taught me why I would never ever want such a job. And the way he did that was because he was being paid to tell the difference between me and a man called Barry Goebbels, same spelling as Joseph Goebbels. And my wife and Barry Goebbels' wife used to say more or less the same things. I know that because later on, circumstances meant that everything she'd said in her application for a domestic violence order and said in her affidavits about what he'd told her he was going to do to her was published in the newspaper, and it was almost word for word with what my wife used to say in our paperwork. So I know that when I was turning up on the court pavement, waiting for the building to open, and I'd nod to Barry Goebbels and I wouldn't talk to him because, you know, there's no point. He was there for the same reason I was there. Our wives were telling identical stories, and Sean McCosker was paid whatever they pay a magistrate to try and tell the difference between Chris Wharton and Barry Goebbels. And Barry Goebbels had told his wife that his plan to gain custody of the kids was to kill her, and he was then going to go down on a manslaughter charge, and he'd be out of jail within 7 years, and then she'd be dead forever. And that's what, as I said, that's not quite word for word, but it's very close to what my wife had accused me of saying to her. And I didn't say that. I quoted somebody else who said something more or less similar. The other person had said, these days it's cheaper for a man to kill his wife than it is to divorce him, because he only gets 7 years for manslaughter. And I'd mentioned before the marriage got onto rocky waters that that was the thing that some people said, little knowing that it would be later turned around, spun and used against me. So, okay, that was what I looked like in front of the judge or the magistrate, and that's what Barry Goebbels looked like in front of the magistrate. Well, Sean McCosker, he figured it out. I got to see my kids whenever because they were given to my mother. Barry Goebbels got to see his kids only half the school holidays, and that lasted for a fairly short period of time because when he took his kids back to his wife, who was living at Guyra, Barry Goebbels shot her in the back of the head as she was walking out of the kitchen. And then he put his kids in his car and he drove them down to Sydney, and he gave his kids to his relations in Sydney, and he said, there you go, you can look after me kids and I'll probably go to jail when they catch me, but you know, when I come out I can raise me kids and she can't stop me. And his relations in Sydney looked at him and they said, okay, never mind. Would you like to have a feed? And they fed him while one of them went and called the police, and the police come and got him, and they took the kids. And Barry Goebbels is still in jail for murder. He won't be eligible to get out for another couple of years because 25 years to life is the minimum sentence for murder. And his kids are in England being raised by their mother's parents, and he's never going to see his bloody kids again. So that is what a high-grade magistrate Sean McCosker was. And I deeply mourn his passing, and I can only hope that his grieving widow and his family get some little comfort if they find this video in discovering that one of the people that he used to sit in judgment upon on a regular basis for years and years and years and years is so sad to hear of his passing. Because, yeah, he did a very great deal in maintaining and bolstering and strengthening my faith in the idea that the judicial system will get to the right answer eventually if you give it enough time and if you don't lose your temper and throw a tantrum in the courtroom. But you have to learn their rules and you have to play by their rules, otherwise you will go down on the courtroom floor looking like a cat trying to scratch on a linoleum surface to cover up a turd. So anyway, Vale Seaughan McCosker. I'd have to say the best magistrate I ever appeared in front of, although Chris Bone was particularly good as well. Chris Bone was the magistrate who sentenced me on a matter which I pleaded guilty to. And later on, when I was a busking poet, he walked up to me at the markets and we had a conversation, and I asked him, did you sentence me for the things that I did alone, or was the stuff that my other half did included in my sentence? He said, oh, no, I only sentenced you for what you did. I expected her to go to court and be tried by a different magistrate because, you know, I'd already tried you and therefore I couldn't try her. And he said, what happened? And I said, well, she went in there and she said that she was guilty of child abuse for letting me beat her son. And McCosker knew what had actually, not McCosker, Bone knew what had actually happened. And he said, oh dear, that's terrible. That's not what was supposed to happen at all. He said, there's nothing I can do about it now, but, you know, thank you for telling me. So there you go. One of the two best magistrates I ever encountered has died a couple of years ago, and I'm really sorry. And I don't know whether you can see me in this because the sun's gone down, the clouds have come over while I'm making the video, but Sean McCosker did the right thing by me. I don't know where he lives, I don't know when his funeral's on, I have no way of contacting his relations. I'll post this on YouTube using what I think is the correct spelling of his name, which when I looked at it on the paper, I was, what the hell is this? Seaughan. How do you say that? How do you get Sean out of that? Now, that's how he signed his name, Sean McCosker. Yeah, definitely the best magistrate I ever appeared in front of. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Like I said, that's an interesting, different video for you, isn't it? Ciao.